Welcome to Madang. Today's special guest is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis on her latest book, We Cry Justice. She shares about the Poor People's Campaign, poverty, social justice, Basileia, Paul's letters, Jubilee, women anointing Jesus, and so much more. Please stay tuned. Madang is sponsored by Methodist Theological School in Ohio. MTSO provides theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. MTSO's 5 graduate degrees include the Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Social Justice, and Doctor of Ministry. Learn more at www.mtso.edu. Please join Rainbow Push Coalition and become a member. Rainbow Push is an international human and civil rights organization founded by Reverend Jesse Jackson to empower people through grassroots advocacy. Please become a member of Push and join 50,000 of your friends, family, and colleagues representing all ages, specialties, and industries. Please take your seat at the table. Please join or donate to Rainbow Push today by going to www.rainbowpush.org. Please join Global Justice leader Lisa Sharon Harper as she hosts the Alley Tour 2022. It is a 4 nights of conversation, woman to woman, on democracy, faith, and the fate of America. It will be held October 3rd, 10th, 17th, 24th, leading up to the November 8th midterm elections. For more information and tickets, go to www.thealleytour.com. Homebrewed Christianity is holding Theology Beer Camp October 13 to 15 at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Homebrewed is bringing together a bunch of podcasters, scholars, and people who like to nerd out when they party. They want to create a pop-up community of those zesty people who enjoy a quality God pod in their ears. Please join me and many others. Use discount code Madang to get $50 off registration. For more information, go to www.homebrewedchristianity.one.pages.co/tbc22/.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com. This is Madang, an outdoor living room for guests to share their experiences and their work. I invite you to come in and stay for a while.
Welcome to Madang. Today's very special guest is the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, who is a co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, with Reverend William Barber. She is also the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. She is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary. She is the editor of We Cry Justice and author of Always With Us and Revive Us Again. She has been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, Religious News Service, and so many other places. I'm so thrilled to have her today to discuss her latest book, We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible and the Poor People's Campaign. For this book, Cornell West says, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is a towering love warrior and freedom fighter for precious poor people in the bowels of American empire. This rich collection of essays is a powerful cacophony of prophetic voices that prefigure our beloved community. So thank you so much, Liz, for coming on to Madang and being my guest. I know you are so busy traveling and speaking and doing so many things. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me, Grace. It's really good to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, and we have so much in common. We're both PCUSA.
That's right.
I always find it so exciting to meet another PCUSA and ordained because I feel like we're a dying breed all the time.
Especially those that are committed to, proclaiming the good word of justice out in the world.
Yeah, so this is such a thrill to have a Peace USA. Maybe I can't remember all my other guests, but you may be my first. No, you're not. You're not. Actually, I had Reverend Bruce Ray's child before. So
Oh, that makes
maybe
sense.
you're my second Peace
Awesome.
USA ordained minister. So such a thrill to have you.
It's great. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, so before we get into this very important book, I just wanted to know how you ended up doing this work and how you got involved with Reverend Barber to co-chair Poor People's Campaign. And I have actually been to a few of your events. You hold so many, so I can't go to all of them. So tell us, because us, listeners are so curious, how you got involved, when you got involved, and how it all kind of came to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, on some level, I learned about the Poor People's Campaign decades and decades ago from leaders from the welfare rights movement and the homeless union organizing movement, and many poor and impacted folks that were looking back at history and towards the future about what it looks like to organize and unite poor people across all the lines that divide us in this society. And so when we founded the Kairos Center, our mission really was looking at how do we reignite a Poor People's Campaign for today. And in 2013, I met Reverend Dr. Barber. We partnered on a number of projects. He invited me along on this moral revival tour that he organized in the 2016 elections. And after that election happened, the two of us sat down and talked and said, what would it look like for us to bring Repairers of the Breach, his organization and whole network coming out of the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, but spreading across the South, spreading across the nation, alongside the network of the Kairos Center, especially poor and low-income people organizing in places, in dozens and dozens of states across the country, kind of ground up movements. And we said, we held a watch night service, actually, the watch night, the kind of New Year's Eve of 2016, a couple weeks before Donald Trump was inaugurated. And we held a teach-in all day, and we kind of put out the issues that were affecting people. And then we had a interfaith service that evening. And we had said we were going to call for and build a Poor People's Campaign, even if Trump hadn't been elected. But we felt even more emboldened in the necessity to call for this moral revival of our deepest constitutional and religious traditions and values, to unite people across all the lines that divide us. And so in 2018, we launched the Poor People's Campaign with the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century, and have really been organizing, ever since. And, so my own story and kind of journey in this, goes back to when I was a kid, and I had grassroots interfaith leaders, talking about what it looks like to pull together human rights and human dignity, and the work of justice as rooted in our different faith traditions. I think Dr. Barber's experiences are quite different and also pretty parallel, of being also raised in families and in traditions where we bring our faith, into action, and especially alongside those that are most marginalized and most vulnerable, and most impacted by the injustice around us.
Wow. And then I know in your book, you said that you were going along with your mother when you were only 3 years old to go to these marches. So I guess your mother had a huge impact on how you will be living your life in the future. I find that so interesting.
That's for sure. I mean, I was lucky to be born into a family that was really deeply rooted in doing the work of justice. My mom was really a full-time activist my whole growing up, from a faith perspective, and she did indeed, bring me to all kinds of marches and all kinds of events, and in my case, it was really connected to my faith. And then my father was an activist and a scholar of his own right, and he helped kind of break open the FBI and show some of the abuses of our federal intelligence agencies and of people in the highest kind of places of power. And he was not a religious person. He in fact was an atheist, but really supported the justice work we did, including from the faith perspective that myself, my mom, and my siblings were coming from. And so, all of that, both in the past couple of years, both my parents have passed on, and I am very clear that both they're still, organizing the other worlds, and also cheering us on right here, because they left a strong legacy of work that has to get done. And
that's amazing, because I'm a mother of 3 kids, and you think that you don't make that much of an impact on your kids, but certainly we do. So we got to act accordingly.
That's right.
Because they do see us. And so for you, when I read that when you were only 3, that is such a wonderful thing. And for you to carry on this, such an amazing work. So thank you. And I thank your parents for leading the way for you to kind of engage in this important work with Reverend Barber. So thank you so much. So you've given us a little background of how you got involved with Reverend Barber, and you guys make such a great team. I just love seeing how you are organizing and working together, and not just physically, but also on the web and on social media, because today the young people are all on social media. So the impact that you're making, I just thank you so much. So how did you get interested in putting this important work together? Because I find it's kind of an interesting book. I've edited books myself, and sometimes you feel like you're just putting stuff together and it may not flow, but yours is so interesting and so important that people who are busy can just pick it up and then just read that little section and put it down and reflect, and you've got this all kind of set up. So how did you begin thinking of putting this book together? And I'm thinking it must have been really difficult. So give us some insight.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of genesis to this book. One, it comes out of a historical kind of battle for the Bible that social justice movements have to engage in if we're serious about actually impacting people's hearts and minds. So when we look at abolition, there really was a battle to interpret and reinterpret the Bible to see what good news was there for the work of ending slavery. And yet there were also many forces, many very powerful and formidable forces that used the Bible and theology to kind of justify the enslavement of human beings, oppression, marginalization. And I think we're seeing a battle for the Bible right now. My first book, which is called Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, takes on, one of the most famous passages in the Bible about poverty, and one that people, whether they're believers or not, and whether they're well informed in the Bible or not, seem to know that somewhere in there, God or Jesus says that poverty is inevitable. The poor will be with you always. When in fact, actually that passage and many others like it are saying something very different if we actually study those scripture in their context and in the context of people in struggle today. And so one of the genesis of We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign is how do we kind of identify some of the texts that have been used and misused to justify inaction in the face of poverty, to say that if God wanted to end poverty, he would do so, to say the only kind of time that folks are going to live in a world or society without racism, without marginalization is that there'll be pie in the sky when we die. But we know that that's a lie, right? And that's not the message of our sacred text. So part of it comes from, an ongoing process of community leaders and pastors and activists and scholars to interpret and reinterpret the Bible. And so, in this book, and it's kind of an alternative type of devotional, right? There's 53 different texts in it. And so you could read one every week, or a congregation could read one, every week. And it puts in conversation a biblical text, sometimes one that has been used in ways to demean and defraud people, and sometimes ones that are the ones that we always fall back on around justice and around inclusion. And it puts it in conversation with stories of struggle today, stories of people organizing today. And so where that also comes from is some of the organizing work we've been doing. The Kairos Center and Repairers of the Breach, helped to organize the Poor People's Campaign. And at the Kairos Center, we've pulled together a kind of cohort of different grassroots leaders. Some of those folks are grassroots homeless folk that are struggling to kind of build the organizing drive amongst other unhoused people. Some of it are low-wage workers, some are pastors or biblical scholars. And so we started to talk about what would it look like to have this whole range of diverse leaders, telling and retelling some of these stories. And it wasn't easy, and yet it was actually kind of really organic, and it came together very fast because people are just hungry to be interpreters of these texts and reinterpreters of these texts, and to put them in conversation with the kind of injustice that is around us, but also the kind of power that grassroots people are building. And so, I'm amazed by the 33 different contributors to this kind of volume, because again, it shows the real depth and breadth of the folks that are out there building a moral movement for today, and taking seriously that we can't just concede the Bible and our theological kind of and biblical foundations to others that would use that to kind of justify injustice when that really has no place, at least in our sacred texts.
Wow. Thank you for letting me know that it was organic and it was a joy to do, because most of the editing that I've done, I don't know, maybe I've done 7 or 8 books. It was a nightmare. So I'm always thinking I'm never going to edit a book. But reading yours was so different. It was like a breath of fresh air because there were so many contributors, and you can use it in different ways. You can sit there and drink it all in, or just take a little sip here and there, and it still all flows together. And I must say, Liz, we have so many things in common. So your other book that you mentioned, Always With Us, it's part of the Prophetic Christianity series with Erdman's, and I wrote one, Embracing the Other. And your name, my daughter's name is Elizabeth, Liz. And then my oldest son's name is Theo. So like your name embodies 2 of my kids' names. So I just wanted to point that out because you mentioned Always With Us. So I think those who are listening can pick up all your books, We Cry Justice, Always With Us, and Revive Us Again. I think they are all so important because there are just so many social injustice issues that we need to tackle with, and you address them there. And I know you address poverty in this book too. But before we get into that, in the foreword, William Barber wrote, "The spirit requires a quarrel with the world's injustices." And that line just popped out into my face because I do so much work with the spirit and pneumatology. So can you just share a little bit about what he was kind of, because you guys are so close, you work together, you are marching together, when he writes, "The spirit requires a quarrel with the world's injustices."
Yeah, well, I think, again, we in this society, the society that is the richest nation in the history of the world, and also a nation that has 140 million, almost half of its population, in some form of poverty. We have a complacency, we have a kind of acceptance of things that just are not acceptable. And they're not acceptable, especially if we go back to our faith, prophetic traditions. And so you have to kind of be in dialogue, but you have to push back, and you have to reject, and you have to quarrel with, anything that would would dare to kind of lessen and shorten the lives and livelihoods of God's children. And so, I think in that forward, it's really just kind of amazing. I mean, Dr. Barber, puts out this, like, kind of the project that is ahead of us of how what a moral movement requires is to, again, not just name what's wrong, but also show what's right. But in the showing of what's right, you do have to point out that it does not have to be this way, that this is not as good as it gets, that this is not what God intended. And for us to say so, right, for us to say, well, we can't end poverty because there's not the resources to do so, or it's just too costly, especially as people of faith, that's to say that God didn't create enough. That's to say that with God, everything isn't possible, which is anathema, at least in the tradition I come from, right? I mean, to say that it's God's will, when God is so clear from Genesis all the way through Revelation that is exactly the opposite of what God's will is. That requires a quarrel.
Yeah. So actually, and he writes in the foreword, and then in your introduction, you write, the contributions of this book emerge from the movement seeking justice for all. And then you write, from Genesis to Revelation, our sacred texts teach us that poverty and injustice are not the will of God. But, I've grown up in the church, and particularly the Presbyterian church, and we just become so complacent. We're not so into social justice work. That's why I find it, you're doing it, and you're being such a great leader, and you're encouraging us that it is this moral obligation. Why are we so laid back of that, we kind of accept it as the will of God? And earlier in the interview, you did mention, this horrific American history of genocide and then enslavement of Africans. We accept it as if it is the will of God. Why are we doing this as Christians and people of faith? Because you clearly in the book are trying to show it isn't. But why are we so accepting that it is the will of God, and then also that there's nothing we can do about it?
I mean, I think some of it kind of comes down to like a laziness, where
thank you for labeling, and naming.
where many people of faith like do not do the work of seeing what the Bible really has to say about these issues, right? And then also kind of ceding or conceding to a small minority of people, but who have been very loud about what God's agenda is, and very wrong. All right. So Dr. Barber often says, how is it that that we have so many faith leaders being so loud about what God says so little, and usually getting it wrong too, and so quiet about what God says so much about, right? And that's been the case for decades upon decades, where the faith voices, the religious voices that we hear in our public square, in our media, in our society, in our positions of power, are ones that actually have used and misused, and warped and distorted teachings to justify the position that they're in and to keep the status quo in place. But so I think often what's happened is that our communities, our faith communities, but also progressive organizing communities, have just kind of let it be and haven't kind of battled that Bible and that theology out. And I don't mean in violent ways, but I do mean that we have to contest this. And if you read, for instance, from Thessalonians, the passage, if you do not work, you shall not eat. I had never heard this passage. I was teaching Bible study in Sunday school by the age of 13. I knew my Bible. I studied my Bible. I was a deacon by 16. And I had never heard the Second Thessalonians passage until welfare reform is coming about in the early to mid 1990s. And you have all of these senators and representatives starting to quote the Bible, saying, well, we can't have welfare because if you do not work, you cannot eat. And so therefore starting to try to put work requirements to welfare, right? Now, if you actually look at that text from Thessalonians, that letter that Paul writes to those early communities, he's saying exactly the opposite. He's saying that there are people that are wealthy and rich enough in the community, in the Pauline communities, these Christian communities, that they don't have to work. And they're benefiting from the work of these poor, low-wage workers. And that you have to all contribute to the community. And he's saying, here's the thing, you don't do the work, you don't get the benefits of the community. That has nothing to do with kicking kids off of welfare because their moms, can't get a job that pays enough to keep a roof over their head. Like it's in fact, completely a distortion, to interpret it the way that it has been. And yet that's what we hear. And over again, I mean, we can go passage to passage to passage. I mean, right now, we're seeing, the overturning of the right to abortion. And you have people quoting the Bible. Well, there were abortions going on when Jesus was living. He didn't say anything about abortion. And so you can't try to go and see what he said. He didn't say anything. What he did say something about was feeding the hungry. What he did say something about was making sure that life was abundant for everybody that was here on the earth. What he did say something about was visiting the prisoners. And so we've allowed for folks, again, another quote from Dr. Barber, who prey, P-R-A-Y, on people who prey, P-R-E-Y, on the poor and the marginalized and the sick and the disabled. And that's a complete distortion of what our sacred texts are really about and what our religious traditions are supposed to be, focused on.
Oh, thank you so much for pointing that out. And when you think about it, nothing much has changed. We know that there's a lot of wealthy people sitting around and not working today and, hiring these people to work, overtime with measly wages. So things haven't changed. And, us distorting scripture hasn't changed. It's been used over and over again to marginalize women and women's subordination. So I'm just so grateful for your book, We Cry Justice, because you point out so many of these passages. And you enlighten us and deepen our understanding and reinforce for some of us what we have believed, because you have to look at scripture holistically. You can't just take one out and use it for your own glory. Per se. So thank you, Liz, for showing that. You also write about we come forward to help establish God's empire, or also called God's kingdom, Basileia, reign on earth as it is in heaven. So, I grew up in this evangelical church, conservative, where, we are just so focused on life after death. And Brian McLaren writes, life isn't this evacuation plan, to go and die and live there. It is this life that we are to live abundantly, as you have mentioned. So how do we go about trying to build this kingdom on earth? Like you and Reverend Barber are doing it. There are other folks doing it. How do you help us who are lost, who are preyed upon, who are just throwing distorted biblical passages to reinforce their own political agenda? How do we do this?
Well, I think if we look at history, and including if we look at the stories that are compiled in our sacred texts and in that Bible, the way change happens, the way things get better is when people make it so. And it's in fact usually when people that are most impacted by that injustice come together with people from all walks of life and build a movement, not just one policy or program or one ministry or one kind of mutual aid project, though we need all of those, but actually put those together into a larger vision. I mean, I think that this is, again, something that we see in our Gospels over and over and over again, this vision of how the world should be, could be, God wills to be, but it is up to us to help to make it so. And when we come forward and we start doing that work, that's where God, kind of joins us, or maybe where we join God, to do that work. And so, I mean, I think about a favorite passage of Reverend Dr. King's, when he was kind of launching the original 1967-68 Poor People's Campaign. And he said, the poor and dispossessed live in a cruelly unjust society. If they must organize, and if they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so I think that the way that we're able to make life better for others is to, come together and organize together, and we see that. I mean, we see that in this kind of new labor movement that's arising right now, where Starbucks workers and Dollar General workers and Amazon workers, folks that have been, again, as Dr. Barber says, deemed essential in the pandemic, but treated as expendable, are organizing and are saying this is not right. We see people right now organizing and resisting, massive evictions and housing dislocation. We see people out there, talking about the climate and not just, in its immediate effects, which we can all feel, whether it's the extreme weather that we're experiencing or the storms, but what that's going to do for future generations. And we see people coming together across all of these different issues and kind of calling into this world, which I think, again, is exactly what Jesus and that movement are about, back thousands of years ago, and the movement that Jesus calls us into, every day, as we speak. It's to forgive and cancel debts. It's to pay people a living wage. It's to, release all those enslaved to injustice and racism. It's to organize society around the needs of the poor. And it's to lift from the bottom so everybody can rise. And we hear this over and over and over again. And it's still true, and it's still real, and it still works in our society today.
Yeah, and just to continue that conversation, you do quote Isaiah 5:8 in your book about the prophets remind those in power that God sides with the poor and judges those who add house to house and join field to field. The Gospels, as you mentioned, announce liberty to the captives, forgiveness of debts, a year of God's jubilees, favor, and on and on. So, but we have just become actually very greedy, and that has led to this climate injustice that you just mentioned, this poverty issue, the housing issue. So there is so much work to do. I don't think it will even end in our own lifetime. So here in your book, you said the purpose of We Cry Justice is to provide strength, hope, and power for the more than 140 million poor. When I saw that, I was like, how can there be that many poor? And then dispossessed people living in poverty in the midst of abundance. And we think we are the richest country in the world. And we see this poverty. And I would probably say that most of them are probably people of color. We forget about refugees and immigrants who do come here for a better life, and then they get caught up in this cycle of poverty. Like the stats that you write in the book is just so astounding. So I don't know if you wanted to expand a bit more on that.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about the issue of poverty, or when people hear, we think that it's like some small problem over there impacting one group of people.
I know, that's how I always kind of feel it is.
Yeah, and it's how we're taught to feel, and what we're taught to know. And we think that if people just prayed harder and had fewer kids and worked harder, that things would be different. But right now, 2022, there isn't one town, one county, one city, anywhere in this country where if you're working full-time for minimum wage, you can afford to rent even a 2-bedroom apartment. I mean, nowhere, right? There right now in this country, 74 million women and girls, and those that identify as female, are poor or one small emergency from absolute economic ruin. Right now in this country, we throw out more food than it takes to feed everybody, not just in this country, but across the world that is hungry. And yet, since they didn't extend the child tax credit, and since there haven't been more pandemic kind of relief programs, half of the people that were accessing those programs or that child tax credit are now saying they can't afford food. And 51% of our kids live in what are described as food insecure homes. In a country, in a world that throws out not just one time amount of like what could feed people, but many, many times, right? And so it's just, it's huge, and it touches, every demographic. So yes, people of color, immigrants, refugees are disproportionately impacted. I mean, it's 60% of Black people, 65% of Latinos, 65% of Indigenous Native people, more than 40% of Asian people. And it's only a third of white people who are poor and low income. In raw numbers in this country, that's actually the largest group of people who are poor. And I think there's some hope and some possibility there of people coming together across these racial and geographic lines, because people are being impacted by poverty, by low wages, by homelessness, by dirty water, by unclean air. And people are fed up. I mean, in nonviolent ways, but people are tired of this and are ready to do something about it. And so I think we see people doing something about it, but the numbers and the stats are kind of stunning. And it shows that it's not just like a small seasonal problem or a temporary problem, or it's not that everybody one day woke up and just didn't want to work hard, but that it's actually structured into our society. And we have the choice and the possibility of structuring it a different way, passing policies that lift the load of poverty. Because again, what we also know is that there are actually solutions to these problems.
Thanks for sharing that stats. I didn't know it was that high. So I hope the listeners are all listening very carefully. Your book is divided into 5 parts. And, part 1 is Jubilee, 2 is Struggle and Lament, 3 is Days of Liberation, 4 is Learn as We Lead, and the 5th one is the Advent of Revolution, and actually 6, the Birth of a Movement. We don't have time to cover each of these, but I thought the first one was kind of interesting to me. So maybe we can expand, or you can expand on that. The first part is Jubilee, and then you write that Jubilee parallels Pentecost, when God's Spirit was poured out onto a multiracial fusion movement of Jesus followers. And I thought, wow, that is so interesting to me. So we don't have time to go over all the parts, but if you can say a bit more about Jubilee, the first part, that would be so interesting to us listeners.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I don't need to get into it, but each of these sections are kind of, many of us in the movements understanding of the different seasons of our church, right? So Jubilee is both the time right of Pentecost and right after, and it's kind of also ordinary time, and it's a season. And again, if we kind of look at the lectionary, if we look at the way that our kind of liturgical calendar works, I mean, it's the content of what Jesus's teachings are all about. I mean, it's and what they're about, I mean, from that inaugural sermon of Jesus's, of like, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. God has anointed me to preach good news, evangelion, to the poor, those that have been impoverished because of structures and systems. Or if we look at, the prayer that Jesus teaches, or if we look at that passage, the poor will be with you always, right when Jesus is anointed. I mean, it's a quote of Deuteronomy 15, one of the most radical kind of Sabbath and Jubilee passages in the Bible. And so here you have actually, this tradition, this Jewish tradition that comes on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, where you're supposed to organize society so that poverty is not a generational thing, that people might fall into some form of hardship, but there are structures, not the will of a good leader or a bad leader, not just the benevolence of family or friends, but the society, the nations are structured in a way that doesn't allow for poverty and marginalization and oppression to be the present, the past, or the future, but to be a cyclical thing, that something bad happens and then society changes it so that everybody can thrive. And how beautiful is that? Like, how beautiful is it for us to remember that which we're doing in ordinary time is just living out the way that God calls us to live out, which is in a society that has enough for absolutely everybody.
Okay, thank you. And then one of the chapters that you write deals with the woman who anoints Jesus. So she breaks this expensive ointment and wastes it on him. And this has been one of my favorite passages, but I know a lot of people have difficulty with it. And you have been dealing with poverty issues in so many ways with your marches and in your several books. So say a little bit more about this one, because I found it very interesting when you, and please, everyone needs to get a copy of We Cry Justice, but just share a little bit about this particular one, about, and then you did mention earlier about Deuteronomy 15, the poor will always be with you. Yeah,
so I mean, where this woman anoints Jesus, and it's really important. I mean, it's really a high point of Holy Week, but then of our whole biblical story. This woman comes and pours myrrh, this holy anointing oil, on Jesus's head, and what we know from Hebrew scriptures is that process, that someone pouring myrrh on the head of a leader is what it takes for that leader to be anointed as and set apart by God as someone who's going to usher in a reign of justice. Sometimes called the Messiah or a Christ, sometimes understood as a king or a prophet. But it's just this simple act of anointing, and here this woman does it, right? And the disciples around her and Jesus just are so mad, and they're so mad because I think we should probably see their perspective. I probably can relate to them more, to be honest, than the woman or Jesus, because it could be that they think that they're trying to do God's will and Jesus's will, and so they say, like, why did you destroy this? Like, why didn't you just go and sell this and make a lot of money and give that money to the poor? Because you've been teaching us that poverty and poor people are a grave concern of God's, and but what they suggest is really what our society still suggests in the face of poverty, right? That you're supposed to earn a bunch of money or somehow get a bunch of money and give the proceeds to the poor. It's kind of doing a charity instead of ever questioning, the process and systems that have produced poverty in the first place. And so instead, what this woman has done is anointed Jesus as Christ, as Messiah, as a leader, a ruler who has been set apart by God to usher in justice, and then Jesus really passes it on to us in that passage and reminds us that he's going to die, he's going to be crucified as a revolutionary, as someone who is a threat to the empire, but has taught us what is good and what we're supposed to do, and it's now our responsibility, to enact the Jubilee and the Sabbath prescriptions, and to do what Deuteronomy 15 that he's quoting, reminds us, which is to pay people a living wage and to cancel debts and to, lend out money knowing you might never get it back again. But then your whole nation, when you do that, will thrive, and you'll have no one in need among you. But if you don't do that, if you're disobedient to God's commandments, then the poor will be with you always. Then the poor will never cease to be in the land. Then poverty is inevitable, not because God wills it, not because it's predicted, but because we are being disobedient to the very commandments, the very instruction, the very example God has given to us throughout history about actually doing the work of ending poverty. And so if poverty exists in our society, and it sure does right now, then we are not right with God. But we can be. We can go right back to those scriptures, go back right to those teachings, and go back to what we know works and needs to happen, and actually organize a moral movement, a poor people's campaign, like Jesus was organizing from below, to kind of turn over the tables of injustice and to usher in a reign, an empire, a basileia of justice and truth and peace and love. And so I love this passage, and thinks it's a turning point in the Bible, because it shows us exactly where we are, how we got here, and where we have the potential to go, and that is to actually listen to God and to do the work of justice and ending poverty.
Oh, thank you so much. I've learned so much from your book, and I learned so much from this interview. I just am so grateful for all the work that you do and for taking the time to be a guest on my podcast. Just the last question. I'm just wondering if you're working on any other new piece of book or writing, if you can just share with us if you are.
So I'm writing a couple of different things right now. I'm working on a book kind of lessons from kind of poor people organizing poor people, and some of the different examples historically and contemporarily. I'm also trying to work on another book based on the Bible, but this one being what the Bible really says about the rich, and what Jesus really says about the rich, and idolatry and hypocrisy and greed, and economic injustice. It'll take a little while to get that one out, but I feel like it's kind of a good companion to other ones that I've published.
I think it'll be fabulous, because we don't have that many books on that topic. So
yeah. I'm trying to kind of
that'd be great.
Connect it.
I hope you get it done and you can come back on Madang.
I would love that.
Yeah, so thank you so much again. You are such a busy woman, and thank you so much for sharing. And I know we couldn't get into every topic, and there's like so much that your book covers. So please, everyone, go out and get We Cry Justice, published by Broadleaf Publishing. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much, Dr. Liz Theoharis, for coming on Madang today.
Thank you.
Madang is sponsored by Methodist Theological School in Ohio. MTSO provides theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. MTSO's 5 graduate degrees include the Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Social Justice, and Doctor of Ministry. Learn more at www.mtso.edu. Please join Rainbow Push Coalition and become a member. Rainbow Push is an international human and civil rights organization founded by Reverend Jesse Jackson to empower people through grassroots advocacy. Please become a member of Push and join 50,000 of your friends, family, and colleagues representing all ages, specialties, and industries. Please take your seat at the table. Please join or donate to Rainbow Push today by going to www.rainbowpush.org. Please join global justice leader Lisa Sharon Harper as she hosts the Alley Tour 2022. It is a 4 nights of conversation, woman to woman, on democracy, faith, and the fate of America. It will be held October 3rd, 10th, 17th, 24th, leading up to the November 8th midterm elections. For more information and tickets, go to www.thealleytour.com.
Homebrew Christianity is holding Theology Beer Camp October 13 to 15 at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Homebrewed is bringing together a bunch of podcasters, scholars, and people who like to nerd out when they party. They want to create a pop-up community of those zesty people who enjoy a quality God pod in their ears. Please join me and many others. Use discount code Madang to get $50 off registration. For more information, go to www.homebrewchristianity.onpages.co/tbc22/.
Join me at the Writing for Your Life online conference, How to Write Dangerously, September 12 through 16, along with an outstanding group of speakers, including John Palovitz, Lisa Sharon Harper, Brian McLaren, Frank Thomas, Robin Henderson Espinoza, Amy Julia Becker, and many more. Go to writingforyourlife.com to learn more.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com.